I'm an English teacher for 26 years. If someone looks at records or guitars or watches, they aren't thinking that I'm wealthy. They aren't thinking that it's like some elevated thing. They're just judging me for spending too much money on the stuff I like. So that's funny that people use watches like as a way to sort of like class themselves up a bit or make themselves seem like they're whatever. I find in my situation that it's the exact opposite. People look at it and they're like, you're a moron.
Totally.
And I'm into it.
Hello everyone, Raymond from Analog Shift here. Today we're talking with Brian, who is someone I've gotten to know a little bit the last couple of years. First walked into our office, I would say about 2 years ago, and had recently been working on making a transition from selling some guitars and looking to roll it into a watch. If I recall, that watch was a Rolex Explorer 1016, and it's kind of gone a little bit crazy since then.
Crazy is a word I'd use.
Yeah, and one thing I know about your collection is that it leans heavily toward vintage, but you do have a couple modern pieces, and I've seen you wear these pieces, and you know they make for great travel watches. But I think we both share a preference or heavy draw toward vintage.
Without a doubt.
That's no doubt, my guess, due in part to guitars, records,
That's what it all comes
other
from.
stuff.
Yep.
What's your feelings toward vintage watches versus modern? Because there is a little bit of both.
I mean, I think everyone always tries to give an answer to explain sort of like why people collect certain things. And I think if I had to give my justification or explanation, it would be, I think I'm just a design person. I like buildings, I like furniture. I've always liked guitars. I like the way that they're built. I'm very technical. And I think what I'm really into are classic designs where they kind of got it right the first time. Just like sitting right there is like a Telecaster, and that guitar has not changed at all since 1950, and they really haven't bested it. And I think with vintage watches, if you get a great design like an old Speedmaster or a GMT or a Datejust or something like that, they haven't really changed them, and I don't necessarily feel like they've improved them. So yeah, I do have like 2 modern watches that I wear all the time, and they're great, but I just don't get the same feeling from them that I get from an old watch, even though I really like them. So there are a couple of watches that I travel with, and one of them is a Benris, just a Type 1 Benris that I really, really love. And pretty much looks exactly like the original vintage one. And my family, we went to Vietnam for 3 weeks last summer, and this is the watch that was issued, during the Vietnam conflict. And I felt like it would be cool to bring it. So on that trip, we were on a motorbike, like going through the mountains, and we're there like doing overnight trains, and we travel kind of rough. We're not like fancy travelers. So this was with me every single day. So as a result, I would never get rid of this one.
We're sitting here in your Brooklyn apartment, and I see an incredible stereo system, art.
What is your take on the relationship between design and functionality? Because it seems like there's a pretty well-balanced synergy between the two things.
It's really basic for me. If something is really, really great, it usually has a couple of elements, and they kind of all have to be there in order for me to get really, really into it. It has to emotionally, move you. And if it's part of your like home where it's going to go on your body, it should look really great, so it should have great design, and it should function. Like it should just, it should be robust. And if you're going to spend money that, is hard to come by, like you might as well spend it on something that's worth it.
Were there any lessons that you learned in guitar collecting or, buying stereo equipment and flipping stereo equipment that kind of directly related to watches?
The big thing with guitarists is that you get into the old ones and it's like a minefield. Everyone always says that vintage is a minefield. They say that you have to, buy the seller, buy the dealer, all this other stuff. Well, they say the same exact thing with guitars, but it doesn't always work. It just really doesn't, and that's been my experience. And just as an example, I got a 1943 Southern Jumbo Gibson acoustic guitar, and I remember getting it and then looking at it, just sitting on the stand, and I noticed that the back binding was really, really white, and that the top binding was really, really yellow and old, and everything else was yellow and old all over it. And then I put it on my lap and I looked into the sound hole, and I realized that someone had taken a router and removed all of the back binding take the back off of the guitar and re-brace the whole entire guitar top, which changes it from being a Gibson, frankly, and it's certainly a vintage correct Gibson. And the guitar had been totally altered, and they were passing it off as something, and I mean, unless they didn't notice it, and then if they didn't notice it, then like, what kind of a seller am I buying, you know? So I got really burned on that one, and I had to have that guitar restored, and I had to eat a lot of money and a lot of time and just a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. So with watches, it's the same exact thing. You know, you get a watch, and then you take a look at it, and you're like, what's going on with these hands? What's going on with that insert or something like that? And then you start talking to people, and people will give you different answers, and it's just extremely frustrating. And I think really what ultimately happens is that you just need to get as many of them in your hands as possible so that you have the sense versus taking someone else's word for it. So you do buy the seller, but I think you also need to really know that seller, and you need to know the watches in order for that to sort of make sense.
So out of any of the watches that we have here on the table or not on the table, do you have a watch that you very clearly wear the most?
So I'm a teacher, and it's kind of fun because kids don't really know watches. So you can kind of wear your watches and you don't have to deal with them judging you or making comments or whatever. But they do have these really annoying like aluminum water bottles that they swing around on like lanyards and stuff like that. So I do have like some sort of like a terrible vision of me wearing a cool old vintage watch and just getting it like clanged with like one of those like water bottles, and like it makes me very upset. So the funny thing, this is gonna sound totally bizarre, I turned 50. And there is an authorized dealer in the town in which I teach. And I've known these guys for a long time, and they sold me a Daytona, a white Daytona. So it's like the most hyped up watch ever. I did not buy this on the gray market. I bought it for what they're selling it for. I didn't have to like make a big deal to get it. I just asked for it. I turned 50. I have like practically no spend history with these guys whatsoever. And they just know that I love watches, and they you know, allowed me to buy it. So this frankly is one of the watches that I wear the most. And it's the one that I think is probably most recognizable. And it just, that's not how I look at it at all.
And this one's got a pretty cool engraving on the back as well, right?
Yeah, that's just because I'm a freak. So it has a Hunter S. Thompson engraving on the back of it. English teachery. It says, when the going gets weird, the weird turn pro. Am I pro, Raymond? I don't know. So I wear this one a lot. The watch that I wish that I could wear the most, I think this is my favorite watch, period. 1675 from 1970. This has an engraving on the back from the Royal Saudi Air Force to a pilot for delivering an F-5 to the Saudi Air Force. And engraved on the day that he got it. It's a full set watch, which I don't really care about, but it's nice to know that the watch went to the original owner and that he kept everything. He wrote a book about flying in Vietnam. I have a signed copy of that. And then the coolest part was, you know me, like I'm gonna try to find the person, you know, whose watch it was. Like that's just the way that I am. I do it with guitars. So I found this guy on Facebook because he wrote a book. And I was able to find him retired in Arizona. He had had some health challenges, and when I finally got in contact with him, I was in Vietnam randomly with my family. So I'm messaging him on Facebook, and when I got back to the States, I got on the phone with him, and he sent me a direct letter of provenance with the watch, signed it, sent it here, so I have all that stuff. And it's my absolute favorite watch. It just happens to be in such nice condition that I'm sort of afraid to wear it the way that I would just wear a watch normally.
Yeah,
because of the
sure.
water bottles.
Sure. What are you most into right now? I know that's
Datejust.
That's kind of a, yeah, Datejust. That's your obsession currently?
I don't know why. Well, I do know why. My dad wore Datejust. He had a Datejust, and he had like the cheesiest American Psycho Datejust ever. He just had the two-tone, you know, like gold dialed Datejust. And I remember being obsessed with it when I was a kid, but I was into subs. So, you know, I have a really, really nice 5513 that to me is probably, this and the 1675 are my favorites. This is what I had in mind when I was a kid, because I was a James Bond, fanatic, and I used to get National Geographic magazine. So I used to see ads for these all the time. But when I saw this one, I believe this was the first Datejust that I ever got. I got it from you guys at Analog. And it's a mosaic dial. I think they call it shantung. So it looks like silk. So it's blue. And when you sort of turn it in the light, it's got like a little bit of a disco ball effect. I like linen dials too for the same exact reason. They just kind of play off of the light, so you find yourself staring at your watch and annoying people. People are like, look at him, staring at his watch. I mean, how do you not stare at this watch?
Yeah, I don't use the term lightly. The Datejust is an icon, but like you, and there's some similarities here and some differences. I worked in golf for a little while, and I would see
sorry
people.
to hear that.
Thank you. I would see people with two-tone Datejusts with a champagne dial spinning around on their wrist.
Totally.
And to me, that's what I thought a Rolex was for
A
years.
bracelet.
And unlike you, I grew up in the era of Brosnan and the Seamaster, so I always thought that was the watch. It wasn't
Totally.
until I got into older watches where I paid attention to the fact that James Bond did wear a Submariner.
Brosnan was when I started teaching and I got out of graduate school, and I was first starting to get like a paycheck. So I was in that period of time where I was like, I think I can actually buy one of these. So my first really nice watch I had for 10 years, and it was just an Omega Seamaster, and it was the Pierce Brosnan one. Like it was the wave dial, the blue wave dial. And I actually got that. That's an interesting story. I got that on eBay from a guy who like just took pity on me. I couldn't believe how expensive they were, and I had my first couple of years of teaching, and I really wanted that watch. So I contacted him on eBay, and he let it go really cheap. And I got it from him, sadly, in the basement of one of the Twin Towers, because there was a tornado down there, and he worked at the very top at Cantor Fitzgerald. I don't have his name. I always wonder if he survived, what happened there. But that was my only watch for 10 years.
This would have been early eBay.
Early eBay, like Wild West eBay.
What's the watch here that you've had the longest? You mentioned this Omega. I don't see that on the table. I'm guessing that's no longer with you.
It's gone. Yeah, so that's the funny thing. Like if it were guitars, I could show you guitars that are really old I've had forever. For watches, I only ever had one watch, always. So I went from the Seamaster and I bought myself, that was 10 years, and then I bought a Rolex Submariner, just like your standard, 2006 Submariner. Loved it, wore that for a decade, and I sold that. And then I decided that I wanted to get a Submariner, and then also to get, a Cave Dweller, a 1655. So I got those, and that kind of started off my collection, and then I kind of just spun out from there.
What's next? How do you see your watch collecting journey evolving, and what might be a grail down the road?
I did get a really, really nice Peristyle Tank Louis. This one's incredible. I don't think this has ever been touched. The hallmarks are really, really deep, and it's just pretty. It's got a flawless dial. You know me, and it's like, it really needs to function in order for me to get into it. And these things didn't have any seals whatsoever,
No, they're negative water resistance.
Yeah.
They're sponges.
That normally would not be a watch for me. But I'm learning as I sort of go along with all this stuff that like, you don't need to have something that does it all. This is something that you wear when conditions permit. Although I have to be honest with you, I wish I could just wear this every single day. You don't even feel like you're wearing anything. Does it like get more Art Deco or classic than this?
Probably not, no.
I would like to explore Cartier, in the future, but I think everyone's doing it, so it just means that they're getting really, really expensive. This was not insane, but I think that Cartier is becoming insane right now.
So the Tank's a pretty obvious deviation from what your norm is. What's next?
I don't know. I don't know. I think I went a little bit nutty, and I basically was selling instruments that I had around, and that's how all the watches sort of came to be. So I think there are no more guitars to sell, and I'm a teacher, so I can't picture giant purchases happening. I could imagine, I know myself, like I do feel like I could picture selling some of them and rolling them into one, but having something overly precious also makes me nervous too. So I'm probably just going to enjoy what I have. And I think sort of where I'm heading is not having something in mind and then letting something show up, because it happens that way with guitars. You know, you're on a road trip, you're driving someplace, you see a tag sale, and then I see an old lift-in case, and I'm like, I know what's in that case. And then you're like, oh God. And then, you know, that's kind of where I would like to be with watches. A lot of these were like, I am looking for something. I ask you or James, or I ask Andrew, and I say, hey, look, can you find me X, Y, or Z? And that's cool too, but it's also really cool to have something show up, and then you're like, that's just really right, and it's a special, cool like thing. So I think that's where I want to go.